Hi, and welcome to the third of four Jet Linx webinars for 2018. The fourth webinar will be in late summer or early fall of 2018. But today's topic is driving down flight path deviations. 4 questions before we start. First of all, who is this guy? My name is Chris Lutet. I'm the co-author of Automation Airmanship and a founding partner here at Convergent Performance in Colorado Springs. I'm also the chairman of this year's Bombardier Safety Stand Down Advisory Council. And don't forget, Safety Stand Down this year is in Wichita the last week of October. Now, what qualifies me to talk to you about what you do? Well, I'll be honest with you, I do what you do. When I'm not the subject matter expert for automation at Convergent Performance or studying out in the field automation and automation procedures and procedures design, I'm a line pilot for a global airline operating 21st century aircraft in 21st century airspace. I happen to be an instructor, a check airman, and a designee on the airplane that I fly. So how long is this going to take? We're already 1 minute in to the 30-minute talk, so you've got 29 minutes to go. There's no test today. The test actually might be on your next flight leg or maybe even on your drive home. So if you can do me a favor and your colleagues watching where you are, turn off your cell phone and try not to check any phone calls or emails or text messages for the next 29 minutes. Now, today's purpose simplified. As I was preparing for this talk today, I thought to myself, how practical is it to expect crew members, line crew members in any operation to perform an error-free flight? And if we were in an auditorium together today instead of this virtual setting, I think if I asked this question, does anybody in this audience feel that their next flight can be completely 100% error-free? I doubt that anyone would raise their hand. But if I put it to you this way, do you think on your very next flight leg, from block to block, from taxi out to taxi in and everything in between, that you can conduct your flight deck and your flight along a flight path that will involve no flight path deviations? I think almost everybody in the room would raise their hands. I know I would. Now, if you can do that on your next flight leg, can you do it for 2 days? Can you do it for 3? Could you do it for a whole week? Again, I think almost everybody has their hands raised. Can you do it over the course of an entire month, over a whole year, and ideally over your entire career? And I think you know where we're going. So what we're trying to accomplish today is provoke thought and discussion amongst you, the Jet Linx flight crews, the cockpit crews that engage in flight operations every day all over North America. We're going to talk about real practices that you can perform differently and or maybe a little bit better with the technology that you operate, whether you're in a Pilatus or a G650. Secondarily, we want to discuss how to use those practices, how to put them into practice with purpose and discipline over the next 2 weeks, over the next year, over your entire career to drive flight path deviations off the Jet Linx flight deck permanently. Now, at your safety summit last month, I think you probably got to be familiar with this slide that Dr. Kern created. Now, of course, it's pretty simple. Down and to the left is bad. Up and to the right is good. And that's where we want to focus our performance to the extent that we can. But right in the middle is what we call the compliance line. This is where the regulator expects you to perform. This is where you might be evaluated to on your next check ride. But it's about average. And we hope that everybody is at least a little bit above this line all of the time or most of the time. Right below the compliance line, right around the safety and effectiveness level, is what Dr. Kern calls the crushing grip of mediocrity, where good enough gets by. Well, I think on his last talk, Dr. Kern asked a question of the entire group, whether or not anybody had ever had to rely on near perfect flight operations in order just to bring themselves and the airplane back safely. And only a few people raised their hands. But I can guarantee you, if you haven't experienced that yet or had a close call, it may be on the way. It might be next week, maybe next year, it may be next decade. But we want to focus on the top half of the curve and move your performance up to a level where you can count on, in the worst possible situation, that you can execute flight operations with precise, near perfect skill. So how do we do that? I want to talk about specific things that we'll do on the flight deck, no matter what aircraft you fly. Every day, repeatable across your entire career, that reflects what the very best performers in our industry have been doing for decades in highly automated airplanes. The two automation airmanship skills that I want to focus you on today are data entry and monitoring. With respect to data entry, I boil it down to this single phrase. I want you to be able to program the FMS, the flight guidance system, and the automation to an accuracy rate of 100% of the time. The FAA, the ATC does not expect you to be 99% compliant with your clearance. The demand is 100% of the time. As far as monitoring, I want to boil this down to some simple flight deck behaviors as well. I don't want to spend a lot of time talking about passive monitoring and active monitoring and the difference between the two. We don't have time for that. In fact, on the flight deck, we only have time to deploy personally the very specific physiological skill that it takes for a qualified professional pilot to execute monitoring to the level that is demanded. So we want you to follow up with purposeful backup and foundational airmanship through every phase of flight after you've completed 100% data entry. Sounds easy? I know it's not. But I mentioned earlier, here at Convergent Performance, we don't study the bottom half of the curve. Every one of us has access to ASAP reports, ASRS reports, and industry flight safety information that teaches us what crews that got on the wrong side of the regulator or on the wrong side of an accident investigation. We don't discuss necessarily what those crews did wrong. Most of us, we have that pretty well suitcased. Our emphasis and our research and our focus has been on the top half of the curve, where the very best, the elite performers among us, routinely perform time after time. We've been studying it for almost 2 decades. Here's the data entry checklist that these performers use every time. First, without exception, these professionals plan and enter data ahead of time to minimize head downtime. It's head downtime that they know they're going to need later. This is easier said than done. We have time pressure put on us, not only on the ground, but also in the air. It's a real point of discipline to make yourself and your crew routinely plan ahead and enter data at low workload phases of flight. This next step is a matter of proficiency often, but we want you to be able to enter FMS, flight guidance, and automation data efficiently without error. Now, sometimes that can be impacted by a little bit of time off, maybe some vacation, possibly even fatigue. But we've got to practice at a high level in order to hit that 100% rate 100% of the time. And I think all of us at some point in our career have been bitten by the secret typing viper. Secret typing, what am I talking about? You have 2 pilots on the flight deck. Each have a control head for the FMS. And while one pilot is distracted with one role, another pilot is reaching down and making inputs that affect or possibly impact the flight path of the airplane. That's called secret typing. And on the most professional, the most exceptional flight decks in our industry, all FMS inputs, all inputs to the flight guidance and automation systems are done in full view of every qualified crew member on the flight deck. This next step is key, and watching elite crews perform at this high level is really like watching art in progress. Measure your plan against the real world. Check the very best programming and FMS solution and all of the interface with the automation against what the real world is presenting to you today, whether it's unforecast or very high climb or descent winds that could affect your ability to make that next climb or descent constraint. Speed changes issued by ATC or caused by moderate turbulence, perhaps. Maybe even having to operate with anti-ice systems in the climb or the descent that can impact your ability to maintain the cleared flight path. This is a key step. Brief primarily off of the FMS. That enables you to fact check the briefing with the jet chart and the NOTAMs, but focus on what the aircraft is going to do. That, after all, is what you're going to be judged on, especially if the flight path information in the FMS is coupled to the flight guidance system and the auto flight system. Now, back up the FMS and flight guidance with good old-fashioned airmanship. If you're like me and you eschew public math, I'm telling you, there's a very, very simple step that I use all the time to back up my 3-to-1 calculation or the FMS calculations for my climb or my descent. And that is simply to look at the time to the critical waypoint, whether it's the waypoint ahead or the waypoint with the constraint downstream. Compare that to my VVI, make a quick calculation, check it with the pilot monitoring, and ensure that we're not getting behind on the descent. Display the right data for the phase of flight. Descent pages for descent, climb pages for the climb. Simple as that. You can't tell that you might be off path if you don't have the right page displayed. This last step is key at every operation, but especially experts hold themselves to this standard without exception, conforming to SOPs. In my interface with the regulator, which comes several times a year, fortunately not on the end of an inquiry, but usually in a discussion about what crews can do to best impact their compliance with climb via and descend via clearances. One of the most frequently cited SOP violations reported by pilots across our industry when faced with having to fill out or complete an ASAP report or respond to the regulator's irregularity report is a violation of, you guessed it right, the sterile concept SOP, the sterile cockpit concept. That means you have to resist with all your might the temptation to talk about non-flight critical subjects during a key phase of flight, normally in the climb or descent, especially when conforming to a climb via or descend via clearance. This last step, call for backup, means fess up when you're overwhelmed or behind the automation. This could be caused by a lack of proficiency. Maybe you're new to the aircraft. Maybe you're just coming back from vacation, or oftentimes it could be driven by fatigue. Let's pivot now to monitoring. As I said earlier, I'm not going to get engaged in all kinds of psychobabble about what monitoring really is. But suffice it to say, the finest minds in cognitive neuroscience and aviation human factors have narrowed down the effective way to monitor as simply moving your spotlight to the flight critical data that is important for the phase of flight you're engaged in at the time. Even so, one of the most famous neuroscientists in history, in fact, one half of the Crick and Watson team that discovered DNA in the 1950s, has said that all of human consciousness is what is contained in your spotlight at any given time. We can only train this spotlight on one problem at a time when performing a novel task. We all know that. In fact, most of us saw it on the way to work. If we happen to drive to work today, we inevitably pass somebody who is engaged in distracted driving, either texting and driving or talking on their phone and driving. We shift our spotlight rapidly from thinking about one task to another task as pilots very well. What we're asking you to do is elevate this to a new level. Be conscious of the fact that your spotlight is focused, is pointed to the exact flight critical data for the phase of flight that you're in at the time. In fact, it's such a conscious effort, you can even discuss it in briefings and debriefings. For example, hey, where is your spotlight when I was drifting 10 feet left of center line and landing 2/3 of the way down the touchdown zone? Well, perhaps my spotlight happened to be on the airspeed and I didn't pick up the drift and I didn't pick up the sink rate or the lack of the reduction of power in the touchdown zone. Things like that can help you manage your spotlight more efficiently and with greater precision and help drive you up and to the right on the performance evolution ladder. Back to what the best crews in our industry do. Categorically, the very best experts in our field are doing these things with respect to monitoring. They know what they're doing when they are training their spotlight on flight critical data. It's called monitoring the monitoring, knowing what your spotlight is trained on and keeping flight critical information from blending into the background. They often brief monitoring roles prior to each high workload phase of flight. I'll give you an example. Every time I brief my first officers on a descent into the terminal area, one of the last things I cover in the briefing is what I expect them to be training their spotlight on at the stable approach gate. What the stable approach sink rate is for the day, what the stable approach altitude is, what the acceptable airspeed deviations are off of VREF, and then in turn, what I expect them to be monitoring from the stable approach gate all the way to coming over the aircraft fence into the touchdown zone, all the way to the taxi and turnoff speed. Those are things that I specifically do in order to set the expectations and keep my fellow crew members focused on the things that factor greatest in a successful outcome to an approach and landing. This is key. Don't buy into the multitasking myth. If you find yourself believing that you are the single exception to the rule across the entire human race, that you can juggle multiple things at one time and still remain equally effective across all of them, you're mistaken. Simplify your monitoring to those flight critical things that are important for that particular phase of flight. Lighten your monitoring load. This is really closely related to what we talked about earlier by using the low workload phase of flight to do your programming. Use that same low workload phase of flight to discuss with your crews exactly how you want them to conduct themselves as you monitor, perhaps today, a precision approach, maybe a low visibility maneuver close to the runway that you expect to be filled with more challenge than usual, perhaps because of high crosswinds. Now, this is unrelated to that high workload, fast-paced phase of flight. We're often confronted with a long, overnight perhaps, transcontinental flight where there's very little activity in the cockpit, very little chatter across the ATC frequencies. At that point, we have to devise meaningful rituals to keep our monitoring active and alive in order to keep moving our spotlight to those flight critical areas of our flight path monitoring. The concept was put forth by Chris Wickens and Justin Hollins just about 15 years ago of the conveyor belt. We need at that point to keep the conveyor belt moving fast enough so that we don't engage in complacency, but not so fast that we just wear ourselves out. For example, sometimes I'll keep an extra fuel log. I'll take fuel readings a little more frequently than I'm required to. Maybe even update the times on the flight log. Maybe a communication with dispatch. In other words, meaningful routines that keeps the conveyor belt moving so that I don't get complacent. Communicate with your fellow crew members when you're unable to manage your own monitoring tasks. Maybe it's task overload, maybe it's fatigue, maybe it's a lack of proficiency, but make sure the others know when you can't be the 100% best monitor for your operation. Now, as a designee, I get to spend one day a year with the regulator at my local FSDO going over what's important to him when evaluating the crews at my particular operation where I spend my flying time. Unequivocally, over the last several years, since the introduction and the proliferation of RNAV profile descents and climb via procedures as well, overwhelmingly, they state, please communicate with your crews the importance of communicating to ATC when they realize that they're not going to be able to maintain their clearance. Don't wait until you're crossing over that constraint 500 feet high and 25 knots fast to squeeze off that call to ATC and report unable. That's entirely the wrong time. Be ready, be willing to fess up with ATC that you're unable despite your best planning, to comply with that particular constraint. Now, we've got a chance to really impact operations here at Jet Linx. Maybe you've seen this around the flight spaces that you work in. Maybe you have not. Maybe this is the first news that you're hearing about the upcoming challenge in July. It's called Back It Up. And I think because of the last 25 minutes or so, you probably understand what we're talking about. Back up your planning to a point where you're using low workload phase of flight to talk about the key flight path monitoring that you're going to engage in. Use that time to best plan for the most error-free arrival, approach, and landing that is possible. So we've encapsulated just a few things on the Back It Up challenge poster that you should see in your spaces very soon. Use the low workload phase of flight to plan and program. Analyze the environment before starting your descent. Double check the FMS solution with manual math. That's that basic airmanship that many of us were very, very skilled at many years ago, but is factors as big now as it did when we were in pilot training. Refresh the numbers and check compliance with ATC. Don't be afraid to squeeze the radio and say, are we doing okay? What's it look like from your side? And if you're unable to maintain that, to make that comply with that constraint, make sure that you call ATC with plenty of time to come up with a contingency. And don't accept any clearance that you can't comply with. Again, this is all coming up in July. So we expect your focus to be on maintaining the best data planning and data entry that you can possibly execute on your flight deck, and follow that up with rigorous basic airmanship through high level monitoring on descents, on departures, and on landings. I want to leave you with just a thought. We can't just program the auto flight and expect it to solve the problem for us. In fact, much of next gen over the past decade has been an effort to harmonize ATC's abilities with the aircraft capabilities as well. The expectation was that the airplanes are complying with these profile descents and climbs already, when in fact, it takes a lot of airmanship to accomplish that goal. So as we go into the July challenge, and as you go forward into the rest of your career, consider what it is that you need to do in order to make the 21st century airspace work with the 21st century airplane that you fly. Now, there's a few avenues in which you can learn more. First of all, Automation Airmanship discusses both of these principles along with 7 others and some other information across all kinds, every phase of flight in 21st century air operations. Now, if you want 2 free solutions, you can just put Automation Airmanship blog in your browser. Put that in your search engine, and you'll be taken to a trove of blogs and pieces that I've been writing monthly for about the last 4 years that you can access and even use in a pilot meeting or just to refresh your own knowledge in a particular area of automated flight. Or you can email me directly at convergentperformance.com. There's my email address on the screen. Don't be shy. If I can't answer the question, I'll find someone who can. Thanks very much. And again, stay tuned. Later on in the summer of 2018 or early fall of 2018, we'll be back with webinar number 4. So long.